Our final keynote speaker today is Nikki Silvestri, who is co-founder and CEO of Silvestri Strategies. Nikki has a lot of experience in food sector work, and I think she's very familiar to many of you in the room. But she's also equally accomplished in public health and climate solutions and economic development. So she flew in from Oakland, California late last night and is going to talk to us today about getting things done with cross-sector collaborations. Nikki.
I'd first like to thank the Southeast Michigan Community Foundation for having me here. It's been really wonderful being in the room with all of you, mostly because it's such a diverse room. When I was looking through the list of attendees, having a cross-sector gathering like this, where so many different people from different types of work get to come together and talk about one thing, or at least broadly talk about one thing, is a gift. And anytime I get to be in a room like that, I'm incredibly grateful. What I'm talking about today is a very humbling thing called systems thinking. I have never been more humbled than when I actually tried to think in terms of systems. One of the issues with systems is that they don't start and end where you want them to. How about that? I had to learn that when I was working in food and farming, that the boundary between us and our neighbor's land didn't actually mean nothing to the soil, or the trees, or the birds, or any of that, right? Another part of my story is that I like to think that my internal world doesn't actually impact the external systems I'm working on, or the way I'm working on them. That's actually not true either, as it turns out. Our story, my story, is both internal and external. And that's going to be some of the lens that I use in the telling of the story today. Where does my story start? With my mother. That's the beginning of my food story. That she loves to talk to me and my brothers about how before she got pregnant, she put my dad on a diet, so that from the moment of conception, we had the very best, right? And then she ate a very strict diet of healthy, the best, healthiest food she could find when she was pregnant. And then ate the best, healthiest food she could find when she was breastfeeding. Now, me and my brothers are like 2.5, 3 years apart, which means that basically she changed her whole life for like 12 years. And after that, it's a lifestyle, right? She's not just doing it for her kids now, because then she's got to feed us when she's not feeding us from her body. So my first interaction with food from my mother, the very first food that I ate, breast milk, was like the best, most caring, most love-filled food. And I know how deeply that impacts my story, right? And then growing up, my dad was really intense about sugar. And when I say, I mean like intense about sugar. The only time I ever actually felt like throwing a tantrum in public was when we'd be in the grocery store looking at, the cereal aisle, which for a kid is like Disneyland, right? All the colored boxes and Tony the Tiger and the Raisin Bran with the sugar crystals on them and Fruit Loops and Count Dracula or Chocula. It's just like, Dad, why are you buying the economy bag of plain Cheerios, dog? What? What is up? I really didn't appreciate it back then. I have to say, I didn't. Now, I deeply, deeply appreciate it. Another thing I appreciate about my food story is that it was complex. It wasn't only one thing. I wasn't just the vegan, crunchy black kid that would get a stomach ache and throw up if I ate McDonald's. Because I'd go over Nana's house, and you know what Nana was cooking. We had chitlins New Year's Eve, to be clear, right? The hoghead cheese came out the refrigerator during the holidays. Hot water cornbread with not organic ingredients. You know what I'm saying? Like, my food story was rich. It had depth. And I was able to take that richness. I took the richness into my work from the perspective of I had a very healthy foundation. So then the sprinkles of culture and reality when it comes to fast food were possible without doing me harm. Now, the story changes a bit when I got to college because I started living at the LA Eco Village because I'm a hippie. I just want to put it out there. My family was horrified. But one of the things about the LA Eco Village is that we had a CSA program. And I didn't know what that meant, CSA, Community Supported Agriculture. A truck would come every week, and we would be putting vegetables and fruits in boxes and delivering them to the people who were part of the Eco Village. And I'd signed up because, that's what everybody was doing. And I got my box, and I'd be knocking on my neighbor's door like, what is this? It's not collard greens, and it's not lettuce. And they were like, it's kale. And I'm like, what is kale? What is kale? I'm 23 years old. Didn't know what it was. Maybe I'd had it in a restaurant, but I couldn't identify it. And every week that was happening to me in my box. And it kind of blew my mind and opened my aperture when it came to the 15 to 20 fruits and vegetables that I'd had access to my whole life, that I could identify. That food security was actually a bigger story, which then leads to the external when it came to my work. When I was working at Slow Food USA with Kate, it was actually really perfect that she told a story about her grandmother's cookbook, because that was one of the big things I learned. When it comes to regeneration and regenerative systems, one of the big things that I learned from Slow Food was conviviality, a return to using food as a way of building community. I learned about passion. And I learned about this community that was an international community of actually a lot of brown folks. I went to Terra Madre in Italy, and I was like, yo, hella people from Africa up in this piece with their coffee and their chocolate and their food. It was so exciting to me to have my mind opened when it comes to what food sovereignty and food justice can look like. So then when I worked at People's Grocery, there were many things about People's Grocery that I learned, but a few of our projects that I'll mention in the context of today, the California Hotel was a 1/4 of an acre behind a low-income housing project. We had a greenhouse, we had chickens, bees. There were a couple ducks that were escapees from Lake Merritt. But it was a very mixed system. It was where I learned about seed saving. And I was always like, man, why in our garden look like these pretty gardens up in the magazines and stuff? And our gardener would be like, I'm seed saving. And I'm like, yeah, but why does the garden have to look like that to do seed saving? And he's like, because you got to let things, go to seed to do seed saving. I had to learn things like that, the complexities of what actual healthy systems look like. And it ain't always like them pretty gardens in the magazine. The Growing Justice Institute was our microbusiness incubation program for residents in West Oakland that wanted to start their own food microbusinesses. Highland Hospital, we did a partnership with the public hospital in Oakland to do a childhood obesity study, where our produce box would go to 15 families that had children in the childhood obesity clinic. And we documented over time how having this produce box increased their children's ability to be healthy and get off medications. The connection of people to each other was a main thing that I learned at People's Grocery. That what I saw at Terra Madre with Slow Food was possible in one backyard. That at the California Hotel, when many of the residents are struggling with mental illness, just coming down to the garden and being able to talk to us, being able to interact with us. It was healing. It was life. It was life taking place right there. I learned about reflecting someone's wholeness back to them as a way of approaching justice and the concept of justice. That if I see you as broken, if I use terms that reinforce the things that you lack? How am I actually contributing to you becoming whole? Or myself, for that matter? So much of the work that we did, well, and it wasn't pretty. It wasn't pretty most of the time, but so much of the work that we did on staff was try to free our own minds of any scarcity thinking that would allow us to see the people we loved, that are our family, that are our community, as anything less than whole. And it really changed the way that we worked, because people actually know. They know. And if they think they don't know, then it's actually not up to me to give them more context or whatever, right? It's up to me to just be with them as they walk their journey to their own emergence, period. Now, it's really hard to write that in a grant, you know what I'm saying? So we had to learn how to interact with the system while being able to hold this point of view and this philosophy, and it wasn't easy. We also had to learn how to reflect this wholeness back to the people that might be causing us harm. We had the allyship program. And that program came up because of how many good-hearted college students would come to People's Grocery like, I want to work for food justice. And we were like, great. We don't know what to, It would be stuttering conversations over and over again. Because it was like every white college student in the Bay Area wanted to work on food justice when I was there, it seemed like. And it actually had to open up a very complex conversation for us about what does for the community, by the community look like. You know what I'm saying? Is it not a good thing when there's a bunch of black folks that own the land and own the farm and have a bunch of free white young labor? Is that just reversing the same thing that we came from? To be real, we all do it. I'm just going to say, you know what I'm saying? It's free labor. But when it comes to our analysis of it, what is our analysis of it? How do we make that equitable? For anybody, I have a master's degree in African American studies, so pedagogy of the oppressed and the sub-oppressor is always kind of running around in my mind, is how do I not become the sub-oppressor? And there's no answer to that, because systems are complex and they don't begin and end where you want them to, as I said. So then Green for All. I'm not going to talk a lot about this because it's climate change, but then becoming executive director of a national climate organization, doing a summer tour to support the EPA and advocating for the President's Clean Power Plan, doing a national survey to really look at what people of color actually think about climate. One of the things that we learned, or one of the things that I learned, is that this concept of reflecting someone's wholeness back to them, when you do it beyond a community and you do it for an entire country, it's a lot. It's a lot. What does wholeness look like when a significant chunk of this country legit thinks the slaves should have never been freed? How do I reflect that wholeness? How do I see that as whole? How do I take that into my work? If I'm really going to think in terms of systems, and all 300 million of us are Americans, what does that look like? National leadership blew my mind, which takes me into the internal again. I hit a wall. I realized that as much as I really wanted to not have a story of scarcity, I did, in ways that were actually really harming me. And I couldn't lead. I couldn't support the regeneration of systems unless I knew how to regenerate myself. So I took some time and I figured it out. And I looked at my story of I am not enough. I looked at my story of not knowing my value or my worth. I looked at the way that I am fairly studied about the impact of restrictive housing covenants on African American wealth and the different ways that the African American community has had wealth taken from them. But I was consistently putting myself in a position to not build wealth for myself or my family. And was that justice? Where does it start and end? So after taking some time, Silvestri Strategies is the internal and the external. We regenerate systems and we regenerate people. On the system side, soil health. Deeply excited about this. I'm going to take a deep breath because I can get a little wonky, and I committed to not being wonky. But one of the things about soil health that's so exciting to me is that I spent a lot of my career doing climate change or food systems, or climate change, or food systems. And it was really hard. I literally bounced back and forth from climate change to food systems, to climate change to food systems. And now with Silvestri Strategies and with soil health, there is a way to sequester a significant amount of carbon by building healthy soil. And as of last year, I had never heard of this. I was doing it, but I wasn't measuring the carbon content of my soil and how it changed over time. I wasn't looking at the financing mechanisms from the climate world that are available to sequester carbon and build healthy soil. I wasn't doing any of that. I wasn't seeing myself as a climate advocate when I was building healthy soil. And more importantly, I wasn't getting that money. But with soil health, the opportunity, the incredible opportunity for me is the fact that it's very hard to do artificially. Some of these microorganisms won't even allow themselves to be studied in a laboratory. You can't take them out of the soil and put them under a microscope and then reproduce them in a petri dish. They are either in the soil or not. Every 5 years, there's new data on how the complexity and the richness of soil has all of these co-benefits that we didn't know about. I spend so much of my time at People's Grocery trying to increase people's access to fresh and healthy food, not understanding that organic farming doesn't necessarily mean you have nutrient-dense food, because if you're not looking at the health of your soil, you don't know how nutrient-dense your food is. I didn't know that. I didn't know about the California drought and how building healthy soil means that there's increased water capture and storage, and being a fairly agricultural state, that's a little important. It's a little important. All of that. So that's a significant chunk of our work now. And the 3 specific projects are doing a white paper on statewide advocacy in California and social justice. Because, regenerative ag folk are not necessarily lots of people of color. I'm just gonna say. At least not in California, right? And there is a conversation about the philosophy of building regenerative systems. There's a conversation to be had about the conservation movement and how so much conserved land is actually degrading because of the removal of different types of animals that actually build healthy soil, and because of a lack of understanding of how to actually manage an ecosystem for health. The hint is that it's not just letting it be sometimes, right? So one project we have is looking at the history of working landscapes and people, how they interacted, the way that the history of historical and systemic oppression looked at through the lens of removing people from working landscapes and viewing working landscapes through a different lens has helped create the situation we have now, and how actually bringing working landscapes and people back together is a way to create regenerative systems, but it has to happen at a very large scale. Another project is looking at regional economies through the lens of clothing. That wool and cotton, those are ways to actually sequester carbon through soil. And they're actually ways to build jobs. Finally, building a web platform on investing in philanthropy, because we're trying to shift money in this sector. So we're building a website that will give philanthropists and investors the high-touch understanding of why they should move their money into investing in building soil health. The other systems project we have is the Food Business School. I'm the professor of the Ethical Leadership in Food Business course at the Food Business School, which is a subset of the Culinary Institute of America. And In teaching this course, some of the very interesting conversations we got into last year, food safety, right? What if you want to drink unpasteurized milk? Because you read that book about what that does for you and your health, but it's outside food safety laws. Huh? What if you want to grow meat in a petri dish? Because cows are bad for the environment. They're not PS referencing the soil health conversation. They're actually one of the best ways to build healthy soil. But what if you want to grow meat in a petri dish? Is it food? Can you 3D print a healthy meal? These are some of the things we talked about because these are some real conversations that are coming down the pike very, very soon and currently. Finally, when it comes to regenerating people, one of the big things we do in that bucket is supporting organizations to be in more authentic relationship with their clientele. Sometimes that looks like consulting about race and power and privilege. Sometimes that looks like the Gestalt cycle of experience and just understanding how people integrate new information and how the integration of new information can sometimes drive you a little nuts if it challenges your worldview. I know we don't know anything about that in this country right now. And I'm working with a firm, 10th Dot Consulting, to look at the fusion of yogic philosophy, Gestalt psychology, and organizational development to develop curricula for helping people be better people and regenerate themselves as they regenerate systems. What's with all this focus on regenerating people? How does it impact my work? That's what I'm going to end on. It actually has a really big, big, big impact. Before I started working in soil health, I talked to ranchers, not at all. I was a fruits and vegetables girl. I was a produce girl. When I thought about farming, I didn't particularly think about ranching. My first ranching workshop, I was the youngest person there, the only black person there. It was the hats and the boots and the belt buckles, and I was like, yo, this is a little scary. You know, it evoked images that made me not feel physically safe as an African American woman. That's real. You drive 2 hours out of any urban area as a black person, depending on what type of rural area you're in, depending on the politics, it can get a little scary. And the level of my personal reflective practice is what it took for me to have a conversation with someone who may not have a particularly positive opinion about black people, but really hear what he's saying when he says, one of the reasons it's hard for me to respect people like you, not referencing black people, but referencing urban people, is that if you were out in the wilderness, like if you actually needed to survive as an animal in a habitat, you couldn't do it. Well, you have a point. I could see that. If you know how to actually survive as an animal in a habitat and you understand the cycle of life and death, you understand the natural world, which means that your pace, your internal pace is a little slower, which means that the pace we move at in city, just there's so much there. There's so much richness there. It informs my work because building healthy soil has to happen from all different perspectives, from a bunch of different types of folks. And if they can't talk, we can't develop policies that work. It's important for the larger conversation our country is in right now because we have turned into a place where the louder someone yells their opinion, the more true it is. And it's gotten all the way up to our presidential election. No matter what side of it you're on, what does it look like to govern? What does it look like to be able to hold a plurality, a diversity of opinions, and actually build something, weave something from that? That is what collaboration is about. That is leadership. That is systems thinking. And if you're working in food systems, you're already one step ahead because food systems is a complex place to work in. So, getting off my soapbox, I will end with We know how to do this. And our internal worlds are just as important as the external systems we're building. Our personal stories are key to how we do our work. Let's value ourselves. Let's value ourselves in relationship to the ecosystem, which is actually one thing. Our artificial beginnings and endings don't mean nothing to the microorganisms. Let's expand our minds. That's how we're going to get out of this. Thank you.